At the opening of the film, we meet Tony, a special DEA employee, and his friend Juan. Tony, Juan, and other police agents were on their way to raid a drug home at the moment. On the way, Juan informed Tony that his wife was pregnant and that he would soon have a child, and Tony was empathetic because Juan had long desired a child. To cut a long tale short, when they arrived at the attack site, Tony instructed Juan to stay in the vehicle and let him handle the situation with his men. Following that, the individuals in the structure were quickly secured and will be taken to the police station shortly. Later, Tony and his men went upstairs, where they encountered a vendor and a lady in the midst of a transaction. Tony also encountered a security guard who appeared unfazed despite the fact that he was about to be detained. When the suspects were about to be led downstairs, the security seized the cop's pistol, sparking a firefight. Meanwhile, outside the building, Juan's wife phoned to inquire about the preparations for their baby's nursery, and the fleeing security bumped into Juan, so he filled him with bullets. Tony became very sad and furious when he learned that his closest buddy was dying. The story then changes to a guy called Nick, who was relaxing on the boat he used as his floating residence. A few seconds later, his government employee buddy Francis approached him. Francis stated that the administration wished to collaborate with Nick again on a mission. Nick, for your knowledge, was a former hitman who frequently worked for the government. Nick initially declined the offer because he had resigned a long time ago and was no longer youthful. However, after Francis persuaded him with the guarantee of a large sum of money, he agreed to the assignment. Nick's goal was to eradicate a gang of traffickers who wanted to bring the American economy down. Tony, on the other hand, who was presently in his workplace, was still saddened by the loss of his closest friend, Juan. Tony's supervisor had recommended him to take a leave of absence, but he refused because he wanted to continue working. At the same moment, Juan's wife arrived and instantly opened up to Tony. She asked him to apprehend the person responsible for her husband's death as quickly as feasible. Later, Tony and his supervisor attempted to question the dealer who had been apprehended in the prior operation. Tony talked as to who was providing him with illegal products, and the dealer stated that his employer was more than just a supplier, as he had larger plans. Tony's inquisitive employer inquired about the plan, to which the dealer responded that he would tell him as long as they let him remain in a luxury hotel when they took him out of the country, and he requested that his punishment be reduced. When Tony's supervisor heard this, he consented to fulfill the man's request. Nick packed his weapons and altered his registration tag the next day. He hurried to the location after receiving details about his target's whereabouts. When he got to his destination, he drank an iced coconut while watching the surroundings. He then went across the street to an apartment while lugging his golf equipment, which held a weapon that would be used to finish off the victim. Across the street, the dealer was having a massage at a motel, as he had requested the day before. Tony and his men arrived a few minutes later to take him up. Tony informed the dealer that he needed to change his clothes right away or he would be brought back to the police station. When the vendor was about to get into the vehicle, he was shot dead. Nick's first objective turned out to be the vendor. Tony then hurried across the street to locate the gunman. He had actually crossed paths with Nick, but no one would have suspected that Nick was the shooter. The next day at the DEA office, Tony's supervisor informed him that his secret agent had suspected a group of individuals suspected of being the dealer's boss, and he instructed Tony to keep a watch on them. To cut a long tale short, Tony and his men then performed a stakeout, but because the CCTV camera they managed to hack did not produce any sound, they were unable to hear any conversations. Tony then took the initiative to enter the building by hiding as a client. However, Tony wasn't able to access inside. Only VIP clients were permitted to do so. Then he noticed a cook about to exit the restaurant. Tony then quickly followed her. Tony approached her outside and invited her to get acquainted, but she declined and strolled away. But when he mentioned that he was a DEA agent, she consented to speak to him. Her name was Mina, and Tony had requested her to assist him in placing a recording device on the table in the VIP area where she worked at the time. Mina initially rejected, knowing that if she was discovered, she would be fired by her employer, but after some convincing by Tony, Mina agreed. Tony discovered Mina had put the recording device he had entrusted to her through the CCTV later that night. Meanwhile, Nick appears to be planning for his next assignment in the same location. He noticed a gathering of people entering the room, and they were evidently holding a conference there. Instead of observing the gathering, Tony and his crew moved away, making it impossible for him to predict what they would say. Nick then enters from the rear using an emergency way. In this scenario, we eventually meet a powerful figure called Hussein bin Fari. Fari is a seller of illicit products who also wants the American economy to be totally immobilized. To that end, he employed a scientist to create a complex device capable of shutting down an entire city's energy with a single touch on a smartphone. Nick arrived a short time later and began assaulting them. Nick killed Fari's security and right-hand man, allowing Fari, the scientist, and his surviving men to flee. Tony arrived later, but the fight was already over. The next day, Mina was shocked to learn that her workplace had been closed by the authorities. Fari, on the other hand, requested the scientist to finish the complex device right away because last night's device was still in the experimental stage. The expert agreed to finish it if Fari paid him $50 million. Fari eventually agreed to the proposal. Later that evening, Tony attended a gathering hosted by Fari's cousin. Tony attempts to inquire about her uncle's whereabouts, but she is unaware. At the same moment, Tony met Mina, who happened to be the event's chef. Fari was presumably looking over him somewhere else, and the bodyguard who had murdered Juan was also present. The security claims Tony is a DEA operative who is out to get them. Knowing this, Fari quickly ordered the security to kill him. When Tony saw Nick at the party by chance, he matched the picture on his mobile phone, but Nick had already gone. Tony was about to chase after him when he met Mina and encouraged her to follow Nick. Unfortunately, they were unable to catch him during their chase. Tony continued his hunt the next day by staying near where Nick went missing the night before. He finally found his car and quickly ran after him, asking Nick for his name. Nick, it turns out, is Tony's real father, who abandoned him when he was in high school. Nick then drove Tony to his ship, which was docked. When Tony asked him about why he left him after his mother passed away, Nick replied that he was a government-employed mercenary assassin who was concerned for Tony's safety after his mother was murdered by one of his enemies. As a result, he ultimately made the decision to leave him. Tony ultimately gets Nick's choice after hearing it. Nick also reveals that the objective of their current mission, which is to find Fari, who is attempting to destroy the American economy, is the same as their previous assignment. As Tony prepares to leave, Nick hands him a mobile phone so he can contact him back. However, as Tony was about to get into his vehicle, the security and some of Fari's men knocked him down. Unfortunately, Nick was powerless to assist him after he was beaten. The story shifts to the scientist, who is presently being questioned by Fari about the status of the device he requested. According to the expert, he still requires about 24 hours. Fari's guys arrived a few moments later with Tony. Fari then asked him who the sniper was who had slain many of his men, and Tony said it was his father's fault. Fari then ordered his soldiers to torment him. Nick, on the other hand, rushed off to locate Tony, using the GPS he had earlier installed on the mobile phone he had given Tony. The power went out in the building where Fari and his men were torturing Tony, and unknown to them, Nick was already in the room, killing them all. Some individuals perished, while others escaped. Nick then returned Tony to his spacecraft to be treated. Following the incident, officers, including Tony's boss, arrived at the crime site and discovered only a few of Fari's deceased men. Tony's employer has finally discovered the device that Fari intends to use to ruin the American economy. Tony was chatting to Nick the next night when he was abruptly contacted by Mina, who had seemingly been kidnapped by the security. Tony was summoned by the bodyguard straight away. Tony then hurries to save her, but Nick stops him and warns him not to be rash, and Nick then offers his assistance. When they arrived at the meeting point, Tony confronted the bodyguard who was holding a pistol to Mina's head. The bodyguard asked Tony to phone his father and inform him to come as well. But then, from the other side, Nick fired a shot at the security, striking his arm. The security was eventually surrounded, and Nick inquired about Fari's whereabouts. Finally, the bodyguard agreed to transport them to Fari's house on the condition that they give him $1 million. The action then shifts to Fari's house. The scientist requested quick payment for his services because his family was in financial need. Fari, on the other hand, claims that he is unable to pay him because the gadget is presently in the hands of the authorities. Then Fari did what he did best, he shot him. Fari's cousin, who witnessed the entire incident, was stunned because she had just learned that Fari was a criminal. The security arrived a few seconds later, aiming a pistol at Nick and carrying a body bag. When the corpse bag was unzipped, it revealed Tony, who had pretended to be deceased. The security had previously stated that Fari was extremely stingy, so he was compelled to deceive him. Nick then ordered Fari's cousin to depart because he knew she had no knowledge of Fari's crimes. Fari's men attempted to assault, but Tony and his father quickly dispatched them all, including Fari. The security then requested Nick's $1 million, but Nick said that if he wanted the money, he should get a job. When the cops arrived 30 minutes later, they discovered that Fari and all of his men had been slain. They also discovered a body bag, which when unzipped revealed to be the security. The film then concludes with a scenario in which Tony, Nick, Mina, and Juan's wife and son gather on Nick's boat to eat their meal. The movie ends here. Please like and subscribe to my channel.